for as long as I can remember. I wanted to know things. I didn't necessarily always care about the subject. I wanted to know. I started off by asking simple questions that all children ask, like, why is the sky blue? Any parents answered that question? Yeah, all parents have answered that question. How does electricity work? And then I worked my way into deeper questions like, why do people behave the way they do? Or how did societies conclude that entertainment is more valuable than pretty much anything else in society? If you don't believe me, look at how much actors and professional athletes are paid. We put a much higher premium on that than we do most other things. These questions have persisted in my life. I've never stopped asking them, and I keep coming up with new ones. And God willing, I'll never stop asking these questions. God willing, neither will you. But as I look back on the journey of learning, I see it as an apprenticeship, a partnership between myself and the many teachers along the way. Initially, my first teachers were my parents. They helped me begin this journey. They answered all the mundane, banal why questions that little kids, that toddlers ask before they learn to read. And then my parents taught me to read. And when I started reading, my father invested in a set of green Collier encyclopedias. And as soon as I learned to find my way around in them, my father quit answering my questions and just sent me to the encyclopedias. And then I just quit asking those questions and went straight to the encyclopedias, and you didn't have to answer. The next evolution in my learning came with my first library card. And I don't know how old I was, but it came from the Lithia Springs Public Library. And by the time they moved on to modern digital cards, I'd gone through quite a few of the little paper ones with the little metal strip in the middle of them. I read everything that I could read in the kids section, and that was even remotely interesting to me. Then I began to move over into adult nonfiction, and then finally into adult fiction. And I learned the card catalog at school as well as at the library. And then I started digging into some real ideas. Now, for those of you who are wondering, I mention these things like library cards and card catalogs because things like AOL and Yahoo and Google and all of that didn't come along until I was in college and after that. So this was back when we used something called paper. For those of you that are under 35 and didn't work with that stuff very much. But I wasn't always a good student. Being a good student requires some effort, and I didn't always put in the effort. I remember having a conference with my parents and Miss Barrett, my 6th grade English teacher, who concluded that I was simply being lazy in English class, so she changed my assignments so that my assignments were all harder than the rest of the class, so that I didn't have a chance to get lazy. And the truth is, I never got the hang of math. In high school, up to high school, I was fine. But then once I got to high school, it didn't matter how many questions I asked. I gave up on it. To this day, I hate to see numbers and letters together with one another. It drives me nuts. I'd rather write the word TWO than write the number 2. I just don't like it. I remember that I gave up being a physician because they told me that I had to get through calculus. And I went into pre-calculus, and they started putting things up on the board, and the professor said, "Now this is all review." And I went, "Review? I've never seen this before in my life." And that's when I decided not to be a physician. But for all the bumps in the road and all the detours, I've still spent my life learning, usually by apprenticing myself to somebody who was willing to teach me and knew much more about the subject than I did. When I started in graphic design, there were people like Art Martin and Bob Chandler who were seasoned graphic artists who didn't really know much about computers, but both of them had been working for better than 20 years as designers, and so they could teach me all the principles of what good design looked like, and balance and typography and things like that. And then as I moved out of that particular field and into a more academic understanding of things, there were people like Tim Craker and Colin Harris who endured me playing devil's advocate in their religion and philosophy classes and terrorizing the other students. And then I got to seminary, and people like Beverly Johnson Miller and Bob Stamps and Mike Pasquarello let me just play devil in seminary classes. They didn't even bother with the advocate part. But the apprenticeship that I'm talking about here, this idea of learning from another person, is central to Psalm 25 and what we just read. It's central to life, really, because if you stop and think about it, apprenticing yourself to someone else is how we learn anything. It doesn't matter what it is. Anybody in here naturally know how to balance a checkbook before somebody showed you? Anybody in here naturally know how to change a light bulb before somebody showed you? Everybody in here had to learn things from somebody else. You had to watch somebody else do it in order for it to make sense. Even the simple things of life require us watching as children. Adults do things in front of us so we learn how they're done. We apprentice ourselves to others in order that we can become whatever they are. That requires us to do two things before we even get into the sermon. That requires two things. One, it requires us to be a good enough apprentice to recognize good teaching when we see it. And it requires that those of us who are teaching are very careful about what we teach. Remember the old kids song? Careful little eyes, what you see. Little ears, what you hear. Well, they're not just little eyes and little ears that are listening. Even as we get older and we're teaching other adults, still have to be careful about what and how we teach. But what exactly are we talking about when we talk about an apprentice? When we talk about the idea of apprenticeship, because I think we pretty much all know what an apprentice is, but what does an apprenticeship look like? Well, the truth of the matter is, in ages past, they didn't have colleges. They didn't have technical schools and people enrolled in to study a particular discipline or subject. There were very few people that went to university in the Middle Ages, and most of them were priests. Most of them were philosophers. Most of them came from families with money. And if you think that the 1% is small now, it wasn't 1% back then. It was more like 0.25%. Very, very few people learned to read and write. Very, very few people went to school. And so the way that they learned to make a living was they became apprentices. The most natural way of becoming an apprentice was usually within your family. If your father was a miller and ran a mill and ground wheat, you learned to be a miller. If your father was a blacksmith, you learned to be a blacksmith. In those days, if you were a woman, you learned to be a wife and mother because they didn't let you do anything else. Everybody learned what they learned from those people who were usually in their immediate family. Now, occasionally, you might find somebody that had some talent for something else. Like, for instance, you may have a farmer's son that they noticed the blacksmith bills got really cheap because he kept fixing the wagon wheels and the implements. And so they might send that son off to learn from a blacksmith. But generally, you learned it from somebody in your family. You apprenticed yourself to somebody who had mastered the art so that you could master the art too. Now, it's a model that's ancient. It's a model that goes back before the time of Jesus, but we in the church see it most easily, most readily, by watching what Jesus did with his disciples. He spent 3 years with them, training them, teaching them. They followed him everywhere. They listened to everything that he said. They watched every miracle performed. They saw everything that he did. And in the end, he sent them out and said, go do what I did. You've learned, now go. As we look at this psalm, as we look at this perspective on the idea of apprenticeship, what we're talking about is learning and teaching. Now, the 4th and 5th verses of this psalm provide a way of interpreting the entire thing with respect to the idea of being an apprentice. The psalmist writes, make your ways known to me, Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth. Teach it to me because you are the God who saves me. I put my hope in you all day long. In other words, God, I want to be your apprentice. I want to learn how to see and understand the world the way you see and understand it. This prayer of the psalmist can be for us a model prayer for beginning or continuing the journey of being an apprentice of God. Now, there are a few major themes that we're going to look at here about this idea of learning from God that come from the text. The first one that we're going to look at is this idea of learning begins with prayer. Now, this week I took a little test. It's on the varied ways that people learn or amass knowledge. And it's really short. It's only about 30 questions. But it was interesting to me. During the test, I was essentially having this conversation with myself. I was reading the questions, and I was thinking, do I do that? Do I not do that? Why am I answering myself? I've always told people that if you talk to yourself and you answer yourself, there's more than one person in there. You probably should see somebody about that. Why am I doing that right now? But the truth is, as I walk through this test, I had this little conversation with myself, and I've talked my way through the answers to these questions. Now, we've all talked our way through something, right? How many times have you found yourself working on something in the house, and like I can remember my great-grandmother on occasion as she was like threading something. She'd start to thread it, and she'd say, all right, move that in there, and then we'll grab that, and we pull that through there. She's essentially telling herself what she's doing. As if for some reason she wasn't watching herself while she was doing it. I don't know. But she was talking to herself while we all do that, right? I gotta move this, I'm gonna take that and put this over. Now this goes over here. We do that kind of stuff all the time. We talk to ourselves. Well, the truth is, when the conversation is one of the major methods that we use to learn. Now, most of us learn the skills that we have from reading about it, but most of us learn because we watched somebody and we listened. The psalmist in Psalm 25 is asking God to engage in that kind of teaching. He's saying, make your ways known to me. In other words, the psalmist is engaging in prayer, in a conversation with God. The psalmist is speaking to God and saying, okay, I want to learn now. Now, what do I do? What do I do? Because this is kind of a call and response thing. God, teach me, and then the psalmist stops. And they're listening. Truth is, when it comes to prayer, we have a hard time with that, don't we? Because a lot of times when we pray, we get our list out. I've got my list. Here we go. Uncle so-and-so, Aunt so-and-so, the this and that and the other, and I'm going to read my list here. God, bless this and take care of that and fix that and repair those people and take them and those poor people there, and I don't know what you're going to do with that. And then we get done and we go, thanks, amen, and we walk off. But prayer is conversation. Actually, prayer is very similar to a sermon, because the word sermon comes from a Latin word, sermo, that means conversation. I'm starting the first half of a conversation with you when I stand up here and preach this. For those of you that are interested in carrying on the conversation, you're welcome to drop in during the week. We'll talk about it. Or send me something on social media, Facebook, email, all that stuff. We'll talk about it. But this is intended to be the beginning of a conversation. In the same way, prayer is the initiation of conversation. When you begin by talking to God, what you're doing is you're essentially saying, okay, God, here's some stuff that's going on in my life. Now, what do I do about that? What do you say about that? What's going on? What do I do? And our place is to listen. We live in a world where we don't do that very well, though, do we? We've got to be moving to the next something. We've got to be busy. Prayer requires time, and it requires conversation. A conversation is not one-sided. We're speaking. We've also got to learn to listen. We've also got to learn to be quiet in our soul, be quiet in our spirit. Because you cannot be taught anything if you're talking. That's why teachers tell the students in class, be quiet. Because otherwise, they won't hear what they're being taught. So if you're asking God for something and then you just keep talking, and when you're finished talking, you walk away from the conversation, you haven't given God a chance to answer it. We need to learn to be still and be quiet. We need to learn that prayer is a two-part conversation. We speak, we also listen. But learning itself that becomes the beginning of it. That conversation with God in learning to be an apprentice of God's becomes the beginning of it, because learning takes a lot of different forms. Not everybody learns the same way. That test that I told you I took, it told me that I am a visual kinesthetic learner, which is pretty common. Because when I took the test, it basically, what it said is that I use more than one style of learning, and those two styles are that I listen, but I have to see it. In other words, I can't just hear somebody say, to turn on this light switch, you have to turn this, and the light will come on. I have to hear them say it, and then I have to reach over here and fiddle with it myself, so that I know for sure that I know what I'm doing. A good example of this kind of learning is not just the light switch, but it's also when I learned to play guitar. There were a number of people, Dan, Danny, several other guys that I knew that were musicians of the church I was going to at the time, and they would say, okay, hold your fingers like this, that makes a C chord. All right, now hold them like this, that's a D. Now put them over here, that's an E. All right, now you can switch between these by holding your finger there and moving it along the string here, and you don't have to. All of that stuff I learned because I heard what they had to say, and I watched them do it, but then I did it too. When it comes to our knowledge of faith is begun with the conversation that we have with God. We're hearing God say, now here's what needs to be done. We hear it in our souls, within our spirits. We also hear it in the things that we read in the Bible, in the experiences that we have. But when God speaks, then we become both visual and kinesthetic learners. We become those people that see it and then do it. And so when we have these conversations, we're working our way into hearing, doing, seeing, doing, watching, doing. But maybe that's not your method. Maybe you have a different method. Learn your method. Learn how it is that you learn. But once you learn that, once you know that, use it. That's the point. It takes on many forms. The way that we learn takes on many forms. But once you learn, begin using it. It would be silly for me to learn to be a certified master mechanic and never touch a car. Wouldn't it? It would be pretty silly for me to go through all that trouble and then not use it. Use it. Learn the things that God is teaching us and then use it. Learning, according to the psalmist here, is a way towards salvation and wholeness. The end result of learning is the part of the process of coming to wholeness, which is expressed in the Bible as salvation. When I was in 10th grade, I had to take geometry. It's the only math that ever made sense to me, because it was about remembering phrases and looking at pictures, and there was very little algebra involved in it. Of all the forms of math that exist, it was probably as advanced as I ever would be able to understand. In that respect, my ability to do math is not exactly what you would consider holistic knowledge. Yet, that holistic knowledge is what the psalmist is seeking. The psalmist is one that's calling out to God in the hope of learning the ways of God, that they may come to a place of wholeness, of being made complete. The first 3 verses of the psalm, the psalmist shows their trust in God, saying, I offer my life to you, Lord, my God, I trust you. The trust that they're talking about becomes the basis for the relationship that allows the person to become a disciple. There's a comfort and a safety that allows this environment of instruction to happen. Then the psalmist declares their intent to be a disciple in verse 4. Make your ways known to me, Lord. Teach me your paths. And throughout the next 7 verses, the psalmist seeks to define how they might become a disciple. They seek to follow the path that God shows them in verses 4 and 5. They recognize the need to be a people of praise in verse 6. And they seek reconciliation in verses 7 through 11. This pattern is a pattern of discipleship. Seek to follow God, praise God, and be reconciled when we make mistakes. The next section talks about those who honor God and what God does in response. The idea here is that being a follower of God has a specific result in our lives. The psalmist says they'll live a good life, and their descendants will possess the land, and God will make his covenant known to them. The life of being a disciple leads us to a very specific way of being that connects us to God and his blessings and his protection, because he will keep their feet from the net. Now, the closing section, the end of all of this, is a plea for forgiveness and mercy. It's a cry for the salvation of the individual, but for the people of God as well. Ultimately, that is what the psalm becomes a primer for, the idea of being a disciple of God, following in the paths and ways of God. This becomes our salvation, our way to wholeness and well-being, or shalom, as we said last week. This is the goal of the biblical story from Genesis to Revelation, that we as a part of creation are made whole, restored to a place of peace with God, peace with one another, and peace with God's creation. It starts with following the teachings of the covenant and the laws and continues into the teachings of Jesus, and it becomes the path that walks us from Mount Sinai to the Sermon on the Mount in order to show us how we have come to understand God and how we believe God has revealed himself to us. The end result of the conversations, the prayers with God, the end result of becoming good apprentices and recognizing the ways that we learn, the end result of all of it becomes wholeness. Or, as the Bible puts it, our salvation. A few things can be said of a good apprentice. First, they learn. Whatever the style is, they learn. They learn the trade. In our case, that trade is becoming disciples, followers of God, through our understanding of a personal, experiential faith and the examples of others that have gone on before us. Second, they practice. We do not become disciples by talking about it. Love God and neighbor, show mercy, give freely, serve without reservation. When it comes to faith, don't step into the water and wade out a little bit deeper. It's all deep end, just jump. And finally, good apprentices become good teachers. They work toward a mastery of the art. We become disciples to make disciples. As Jesus says in Matthew, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey the things that I've commanded you, that I've shown you. And that is our task. We, as the people of God, are tasked with going and learning to be good disciples, that we might go and make good disciples, that we as good apprentices might become good teachers and take on apprentices of our own.